Hello, welcome to another episode of Oh, What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. In this episode, Jessica, Chris and I are going to be looking at the comic strip Charley's War, which ran in various iterations of the British comic Battle from 1979 through to 1986. The comic strip was developed and mainly written by Pat Mills. It follows Charley Bourne, who volunteers for the British Army aged 16. We then follow Charley through his wartime experiences, largely on the Western Front, but the story does switch to look at the home front with Charley's family in the East End of London, where they suffer Zeppelin raids in the aftermath of the explosion of the Silvertown munitions factory. Pat Mills has said he was trying to move away from just concentrating on a narrative simply based on trench combat, which he didn't think the readers would find adventurous and enjoyable, which in turn the publisher would not like. Now, I actually read some of Charley's War when Battle as a title was folded into Eagle sometime presumably in the late 80s. I can't quite put a date on it, but anyway, I'm not sure it made that much of an impression on me at the time, which is interesting. But I wonder how either of you found the story of Charley Bourne. Where did you first bump into it?
Firstly, I assumed you were only 21, Angus. How could you possibly have been reading it in the 1980s?
I was just going to say, as an American and B, perhaps less relevantly as a woman, this was not something I came across until I started being an academic researching the First World War. And even then, it's one of those things that sort of popped up in conference papers occasionally. There's an academic article on Charley's War that was published by the journal Lion and the Unicorn that actually came out of a conference that I helped organize a number of years ago. And I think that in some ways may have been my first encounter with Charley's War. So I've only ever really come across it as an academic source, which I think probably shapes my attitude to it.
Chris, were you at these news agents on a Saturday morning? Or you might be too young actually to get them as they come out. You might have had to wait for the graphic novels.
Firstly, I mean, let's be honest, there's only ever one place I was ever going to be on a Saturday morning, and it was in bed. Actually, weirdly, I didn't encounter Charley's War. I knew of kind of commando comics and battle comics and stuff like that, but in my mind, they were always very Second World War. And being a vaguely fake historian, my kind of interest in the World Wars kind of ebbed and flowed over my younger life. And there was a comic shop in Brighton called Dave's Comics that I used to wander in fairly regularly. And when I was a PhD student, I noticed the big bound copies of Charley's War at the back. I was like, oh, those are First World War, and that's interesting. It's a graphic novel, and I like those. I should probably read these for a mix of kind of interest and also for study. But being a PhD student, I didn't have any money, so I didn't. And so this has actually been the first kind of prolonged time that hasn't been me surreptitiously stood in the back of a comic shop, desperately trying to read bound copies of a book that I'm absolutely not going to buy before I get kicked out, of sitting down and actually kind of reading some of them. God, it's wild, isn't it? There's a lot going on in the pages of Charley's War.
The reason I've just been re-flicking through them again with this in mind, because I've been ploughing through them for the last 6 months out of curiousness, and then I sat down, half an hour ago, thought I'll just go through again, and it was amazing what I spotted on another read, putting when you started to think about how you're going to talk about it. There is a lot going on, a lot of peculiar humour. There's a lot going on of things that we've already been talking about. Music, quite a lot of music in it, which is possibly odd for a comic. And there's a lot of footnoting going on, which I then found interesting because it adds a certain authenticity to it. It's almost like what it reminded me of oddly is George MacDonald Fraser adding authenticity to Flashman, where he adds corrections into the footnotes. And it adds that authenticity when he's adding little bits at the bottom.
Well, there's very much a sort of tradition, isn't there, of a literary tradition of, the found manuscript where the editor is adding footnotes to the manuscript that's been uncovered, a sort of meta narrative going on. I think George MacDonald Fraser was one of the earlier proponents of that, but it's become quite a tradition.
Well, not only that, you have from that authenticity point of view, you have the dual narrative going on of Charlie's representation of his war in his letters to his parents, and his war that you're seeing playing out almost in documentary form. But those come in. There's the Bairnsfather postcards as well that he's writing that are reproduced in there as well. So you have this sort of dual narrative with the letters home adding some different authenticity, or badly written.
But it's interesting, we're using the term authenticity and what we count as authenticity, because one of the, when you say there's a lot to it, Angus, you sent us a list of all the different series, and there are 10 of them all told, aren't there? And they really try and pack everything in. They've got one that is the story of a French soldier, so you're getting a different perspective. They've got one that's about the Air Force. They've got the Somme. They've got something from the Russian front, I think. I did not read all of them, let me just say.
So at the end of the war, Charlie's arch nemesis, Captain Snell, reveals to Charlie that he's told the upper echelon that Charlie has volunteered to be sent to Russia to fight the dirty Bolshevik. At which point Charlie kills Captain Snell, the snooty officer that I think you meet right in the very first issues. Yeah, so they go to Russia. And then there's Charlie's, I think it's his cousin, is at the Falkland Islands naval battle. And Pat Mills was trying to take it to the Battle of Jutland, but the publisher politely tapped him on the shoulder and said, I think we're taking this too far. We're getting a negative response. But the Falklands sort of fitted in because those issues came out around the time of the Falklands War. So the only place Charlie's War as a comic strip doesn't take us really is the Middle East. And Pat Mills states he never could quite work out how to get us there.
There's an element of, I've mentioned it to Angus before, of like the Sharp effect. He's writing so many Sharp books. He's desperately trying to find doing something in one of his books so he can be somewhere else, so he can release another book about it. So Charlie teleports around the Western Front to get involved in basically everything that you could possibly conceivably have been, even things that are taking place at the same time, because there's always a way that he can be wherever it is that he needs to be to tell this narrative. But I mean, it's entirely possible that he did the Eeps, Passchendaele, the Somme, and all of that. But I do wonder how feasible it would be for somebody to leave with this type of war service.
I mean, he does cheat. Let's be fair. Sometimes the story relapses to his brother Wilf through sort of letters as you're opening, and Wilf tells you about his experiences in the flying course. It's not as if Charlie's jutting in and out of all these different service roles.
But there is an element of that. And I was thinking a little bit back to 1917 and our discussion of that, of when you have this sort of everyman image or everyman character as your eyes, the reader's eyes on the war. Suddenly you need to encompass everything. You can't miss any aspect because they've got to represent the wars of 5 million men, plus, all their families on the home front. And that's one thing about, the cultural representation of war, where it can never be authentic, is that it simply cannot encompass every single story of the war. And I think what I find challenging about something like Charlie's War is this, it's such an explicit desire to do that you do get the sort of teleporting around the front, which detracts from the authenticity for me. But that's a personal feeling about it.
They also, in the way that they frame Charlie, make it kind of overt but implied image of the Tommy, in that, right from the very beginning, they describe Charlie as not being smart, but being loyal and brave. So he's a trustworthy, courageous idiot, which, if you wanted to try and define what is the image of the fighting Tommy, in the First World War, as a potentially a working class lad who isn't smart but will fight and die for king and country, you're going to end up with something that looks very much like Charley Bourne. in that aspect, maybe with some of the harsher edges rounded off.
The odd thing about that stupid narrative, he's not very... God, and they make a point regularly of pointing out how stupid he is. So at one point he throws a hand grenade and doesn't pull the pin out, and it hits the German in the face, and so it's all a bit of a farce, but at least he saves the day because the German can't retaliate. Later on, that narrative seems to get forgotten. It's not so overtly, isn't Charlie stupid? Well, no, he's just there doing his bit. So the stupid thing that they really do make a big thing of repeatedly in those early issues sort of disappears. And I think it's the same with the boy soldier aspect as well. It's all played up quite a lot at the start, but then actually it drifts away almost as if that hook isn't needed to draw you in. We don't need him to be a boy soldier. Actually, it works without the boy soldier.
The boy soldier aspect is interesting because it very much reflects a tradition of boys' adventure narratives from the war years itself. And I'm completely blanking on the author who wrote sort of with Kitchener at Khartoum and various others I think it was for the boys' own paper. Certainly it was one of those sort of boys' adventure narratives, adventure papers, which were very specific about, sort of 14, 15-year-old boys who run away from home and join up with the British Army and go off and have imperial adventures. And Michael Parris has written about quite a lot about these in Warrior Nation, that focusing on youth and the boy as the central heroic character. And I think that's where Charlie being a boy soldier comes from, is to tap into that the audience for these are young men of that age, that age group or slightly younger. So it's to give them a level of identification with the character that perhaps once they're hooked in, you're right, they don't need to be captured, their attention doesn't need to be captured in the same way. They're now invested in the character, and that can be left to one side. As
the war goes on, there's an element, I think, of that idiocy, that stupidity kind of ebbs away because he's becoming, he's clearly a veteran. You can't have gone through all of these things, not learned the skill of survival and the skill of killing. So he never quite kind of tips his way into, action man, Rambo-esque one-man killing machine stuff. But, there is a knowledge of, he has learned how to fight and survive in war. So how stupid can he really be by the time you get to the Passchendaele ones and the 1918 ones? Although what doesn't ebb away at times is his sense of right and wrong. That kind of morality sticks with him because he gets very upset with Schnell at the end of the 1918 ones that he has been betrayed in this manner. But his naivety, that kind of wide-eyed innocence aspect, seems to ebb away a bit.
Well, I was just thinking about what you were saying about his skill of soldiering. The one perhaps unusual thing in Charlie's War is it's not a band of brothers. It's not a unit of men going through that might some get killed or they all dramatically get killed at the end. The thing with Charlie's War is it's essentially him and characters come and quite literally disappear. So his mate Ginger cracks a joke, and then disappears. He's just blown up with a shell, and that's Ginger gone. So in many respects, Lucky, I can't remember what happens to Lucky. Lucky gets blown up somehow in a shell hole. It's that randomness of death. So whilst Charlie might be a veteran, he's somehow himself been lucky to survive the randomness of the artillery, which seems to be usually the way people randomly get killed in Charlie's War. There's quite a concentration on sniping as well. There's a lot of random, just completely random deaths.
I wonder how that played out in the audience. That character's gone now. Is it something like, oh my God, I can't believe they killed Lucky, or I can't believe they killed Ginger? Or is it just, right, well then we've got 500 more episodes of this to go, so I guess that guy's won't be coming back. I wonder how it was received by the audience, if it was kind of seen as a manifestation of the randomness and shockingness of death by artillery in the war, or if it was just the way that those comics work.
Something I was thinking about before was that the fact that if you think about the way boys' comics work, people probably only drop into them for a certain period of their lives, maybe 2 years. So actually quite regularly, there'll be a whole new generation saying, 11 or 12-year-olds picking up the comic. So there'll be very few who'll have read it from the start as it was published as a comic. There'll be a lot of kids in 1986 only ever being aware of the Second World War version of Charley's War, unaware of Charley being a boy soldier in 1916 from 1979. Just the way it sort of secularly works as people come and go. So that must slew the way you write the comic. Now, Pat Mills openly states this is an anti-war comic strip, and his big inspiration was the 69 film Oh, What a Lovely War. Do we feel this is an anti-war strip? Does it fit with other anti-war media?
It does feel like it was inspired by the 1960s narrative of the war. And it's interesting. The thing about the stupidity struck me because, if you're thinking in terms of lions led by donkeys, if you're emphasizing the sort of simple blind loyalty of the Tommy, perhaps that's more of a narrative of donkeys led by donkeys. And that class element of it, the narrative of the futility of the war is the upper classes using mass of the working classes as cannon fodder for their own snobbish and not very clear ends. And that's very much a mid-century, what I always feel is sort of a 1960s narrative of the futility of the war, with that very strong emphasis on the class system. And I think that certainly comes out of this.
Well, there's that really early on in the episodes where he's carrying the picnic hamper for when they win the Somme on the first day for the officer. But then curiously, you have the other officer, Lieutenant Thomas, who allows Charley to steal the hamper and eat the partridge. I'm not sure if in later issues that more sympathetic officer disappears and they all tend to fall into more of the stereotype of the Snell.
You end up with a weird comparison with it as well, because there are definitely anti-war messages in it, and I'm thinking about the Verdun ones with the French foreign legionary who's defected or deserted and has ended up in London, and him and Charley end up having a prolonged conversation about what happened to him when he was fighting at Verdun and got trapped in Fort Vaux and all that type of stuff, which is, here's how horrible the war has been. I was betrayed, I was brutalized, all these awful things happened to me, we nearly died of thirst, I was tortured, blah, 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 all that horrible stuff. And yet, the underlying message is still, but it is your duty to go back and fight this. You end up with, this is a horrible, awful thing that is, killing lots of people, and it's brutal, and it's awful, and it's dreadful. And yet, the honourable thing for people like Charley and Blue and their comrades to do is to continue fighting the war and to win it.
And I think that's what's quite interesting about it, not just in Charley's War, but about it as an anti-war narrative. And what has sort of sparked quite a lot of more recent scholarship really is that isn't really a good explanation for why men carried on fighting for 4 and a bit years. That there needs to be something more than just, it is your duty. Or you're a bit stupid and loyal. There had to be motivations for these men beyond blind loyalty to whatever ideal it was. And that's sparked a lot of the scholarship about morale and about the daily lives of soldiers, which you and I have been writing about recently, Chris, to try and understand, well, why didn't this mass of men just stop? Why didn't the Christmas truce lead to more, or why didn't the war end in Christmas 1914? What kept it going from the bottom up rather than the high politics of it?
What's interesting about the just mentioning the Christmas truce is that there's a Christmas truce in Charley's War as well, but it's not in 1914. It's in 1917, and they use it as part of a storyline that did genuinely make me laugh out loud. And I'll explain why. Because there's something that I love about a particular type of film that you often see in like comic book films or in sci-fi films, like where the film is about to do something that is purely aimed at the audience, you know, to make them go, oh, I recognize that. And I always go to is there's a Star Trek film that's got Benedict Cumberbatch in it, and he's playing a character who then turns out to be playing a different character. And there's a bit where everywhere he's like locked up in a prison, and he's talking to Kirk and Spock, and he goes, you know, the name that you're using for me at the moment, that's not my name. My name is Khan. And the audience is supposed to go, oh my God, it's Khan from Wrath of Khan from the original series. I recognize that reference. But the characters, it means nothing to them. You know, their response would be, who? Is that supposed to mean something? Okay, fine, that's your name. I'll just get some Tipex out and I'll change the one I've got on my board, and I'll write in your new name. And what you get in Charley's War is a moment where a character absolutely breaks the fourth wall, because there's a German in a dugout, and he's talking about stuff, and he looks over ostensibly to a character, but actually out at the viewer, the reader, and goes, you know, what are you doing over there with all of that stuff, Corporal Adolf Hitler? Because all of the audience was going, oh my God, it's Hitler. I can't believe it. We're going to get a storyline with Hitler. Whereas all the characters, that seems a very weird way to introduce a random person who just happens to be in your trench, as if that's in some way more meaningful than any of the other characters. And you end up with this prolonged storyline of Hitler, who keeps talking about he's going to carry on his political plans, and one day his time will come. He turns into a supervillain, a comic book evil villain who, you know, you may have foiled me this time, Charley, but I'll be back.
Well, we've encountered that before, because doesn't Hitler turn up in The King of Hearts? We commented on that, the ironic wink to the meta narrative of history. And I suppose that goes back to Angus's point about people not necessarily reading this in order. And that the audience would have been potentially more familiar with the Second World War. So suddenly having Hitler there makes, you know, even more sense to the audience. Yeah. Yeah.
And Hitler doesn't participate in the Christmas truce. He stays in the dugout in 1917 working on political pamphlets because he's Hitler.
I have to say, I thought that plot line was particularly poor. It's like, why have you shoveled him in? And it's just the way that you have the and to be fair, all the way through Charley's War, the Germans, there's good Germans like Charley who are just there doing the bit, and there's always one who's usually a Prussian, who's more radical, who's the nasty one, but they're just, which work. It has a sort of a ring to it. But then you change the nasty Prussian to be Hitler, and it's like, oh, I think you've over-egged the pudding with this storyline. Oh, look, he's ranting and there's spit flying as he sort of rants and raves and flings his arms about in some sort of practice for his later speech making in the 30s. He's like, oh, I think you've got you might have jumped the shark with this series.
Then you end up with all of the other Germans behind him, basically, oh, honestly, Hitler. Now, why are you always making these political speeches? It's never going to go anywhere. In fact, actually, that's the line. It's never going to go anywhere. Why are you interested in politics? You're a painter.
Pat Mills, now, when he's talking about his big influence, sort of was Oh, What a Lovely One being anti-war strip, he also overtly states that he didn't want to write a comic strip where the central narrative is war is hell, such as Apocalypse Now. Now, is Charley's War a war is hell narrative? Do we feel it edges towards that? Which then got me thinking about, well, why in 1979 is he coming out with War is Hell? And I thought we're pre-Vietnam boom in the war films. And actually, I looked it up. We're not. He's writing it at the start of the Vietnam War film boom of Apocalypse Now. Deer Hunter, sorry, my mind went blank. There's a few all come out just at the same time, which I thought was interesting.
Because Apocalypse Now was being worked on in like 1975, 76, because George Lucas was working on it before he did Star Wars.
There's quite a lot of big Vietnam films come out that period. Did I have them listed? Deer Hunter, Boys of Company C, Go Tell the Spartans. So it's all there in sort of rolling. I thought but First Blood was 70s, but apparently that was 82. Do we get War is Hell, which in itself as a statement is actually an Americanism, isn't it? It's Sherman. Is it? No, is it? Yeah, hang on, it's not Sherman, it's the other one.
Patton?
No, American Civil War.
Oh, God, Lee, Grant, and Will Jackson.
It's Grant's is War is Hell, isn't it? Which got me thinking, does that mean that the War is Hell narrative is an American narrative, whereas Charlie's War is kind of uniquely not War is Hell, and it's somehow some depressing celebration of the working class Tommy rather than isn't war awful?
I mean, on a sliding scale of, War is Hell with, I don't know, something hugely uplifting at one end and the tardy comics at the other. I think Charlie's War, I mean, it's not presenting a war that has an awful lot to recommend it. But by focusing in on, the ground zero Tommy experience, there's going to be an element of, in these types of comics, things are going to get blown up, people are going to get shot, because otherwise there's going to be nothing you're going to put in your comic.
Do you want to explain your references to the tardy comics? Because I'm not sure we've introduced our listeners yet, Chris.
Okay. So the Tardy wrote various kind of French graphic novels, and I've mentioned before there's a big kind of French graphic novel kind of interaction with the first one. I was saying to just before we started recording that if you go to Verdun, which I heartily recommend, and you go to Fort Douaumont, in their gift shop they have a lot of French graphic novels all relating to the First World War. And if you go into the equivalent of the Brighton graphic novel shop that I spoke about in France, you'll find this ongoing interaction with graphic novels in the First World War. And Tardy wrote, I think his first one is actually, it was much earlier than I thought it was. I'm pretty sure that the first one, which is called It Was the War of the Trenches, is actually in 1983 or something like that. It wasn't released in English until 93 or later, and then wasn't packaged up into the version that I've got until the 2000s. And then he wrote a separate one called God Damn This Bloody War, or something along those lines. And the image that you get in Tardy's graphic novels and comics, which feature almost exclusively on the French experience, is horrendous. It's death and destruction and meaningless and despair. All of the things you want to think about in regards to War is Hell, it appears within the Tardy pages, and you end up with a lot of kind of little vignette stories, like very brief stories across 3 or 4 pages, which end with an explosion and the main protagonist dies, or someone loses their mind and wanders out into no man's land, looking for someone who disappeared in no man's land 2 weeks ago, and they get machine gunned by a German. It's all about the life and the waste of human kind of sanity, and or is not that. There is fairly grim bits in Charlie's War, but it isn't Tardy in relation to the kind of a pure war is an illegitimate, monstrous thing that is inflicted upon ordinary people.
Well, you have a chance of surviving, unlike Tardy, where it literally is all men must die. Everybody dies. It is relentless death. And there's very little anything really to uplift the main characters, who just sort of waft through it and die, or, everyone dies around them. There's no camaraderie. Charlie's War has camaraderie. All right, the comrades come and go in and out of the strip, and some die, but there is sort of a camaraderie. Where Tardy, is often the men don't even know one another. Oh, he's some guy who does this, and he's dead.
It's interesting that we're talking in such extreme terms. When I'm just thinking, when we've talked about other forms from this period, films in particular, I'm thinking of, but even, novels as well, we talk about futility. And I don't think there's any question that the futility narrative is the central narrative here. There's none of the ambivalence of the interwar period about the meaning of war. And to that extent, yes, I do think Charlie's War has an element of War is Hell. It's not the particular circle of hell that Tardy is inhabiting, But if we talk about it in the terms that we talked about other cultural outputs, the futility narrative, then yes, I think it is very much a war is futile. And in some ways, I think it sort of has to be to keep going, because otherwise you're back to this, well, why does it carry on? If there's a point to it, then there must be a conclusion to it. And the fact that you can keep going, off on to the Russian front, Charley's war never ends. And the only way to maintain that in some ways is either there is some great truly heroic narrative of eventually the city on the hill, to use another Americanism, the shining city on the hill of Reagan's imagining, or there is just nothing. It's the endless repetition of the same over and over again. And that's the only way you're going to maintain the momentum that keeps it going over many, many editions. Is that making any sense to either of you?
Well, I was just sat thinking, I don't recall there being any reason for Charley to really fight. I don't think it's ever addressed in the strip why they're fighting, what the goal is, what the end point is. I think in one of the really later ones, just before they win, there's a guy shouting, on to Berlin, which I guess gives you somewhere where they wanted to get to. Am I right in saying Tardy Chris does actually address why the war starts, or here's a version of why the war starts?
Yeah, I mean, you get certainly from the French point of view, the invasion of France and Belgium by the German army in 1914, but it comes laced with a very heavy war profiteers are monsters, and this war is being fought because industrial powers want to make money. Elements to it. Well, you interestingly don't really get in either of them. And this is something that I flagged up maybe before in conversations over First World War computer games, is neither of them really explain why the war ends. And that, I think, remains an ongoing kind of popular blind spot about the First World War. The idea that it ends because everyone's quite tired, and there seems to be slightly... It's Dennis Showalter's suggestion that in the minds of the public, attrition warfare means the last 3 British and French soldiers stagger on aged legs across no man's land and bayonet the last 2 surviving Germans. It's that idea that this is a war of attrition that has simply just run out of puff, rather than actually there's something happening militarily here and socially in Germany that has led to the.
Well, from Charley's point of view, the war doesn't end; he goes to Russia. So,
yeah.
Volunteered to go to Russia. So it doesn't end. Your point of morale, just to cycle back to that, Jessica, it is sort of addressed. Morale, I was going to try and weave into the idea of morale. Sure, Charley does suffer from. He has his mental traumas. And then much later on, he kind of questions killing and decides to have a go being a stretcher bearer, which amusingly they don't think he's very good at.
Which is the bit that I wanted to read and then got sucked into marking hell and never got around to reading. So I will read it eventually. I'll get there.
Well, the stretcher bearer bit's fascinating because he's tired of the killing, so he volunteers to become a stretcher bearer, which they came grumbling at, saying, well, we're going to have to get rid of him. And there's a sort of a bit where someone accuses him of trying to steal from the dead. The interesting bit about that is that Charley's war then takes you to a point now with a guy on a battlefield tour on a bus saying, I wonder what happens to the stretcher bearer who saved my life that day when we all got blown up. So it takes you, and it's odd. It's kind of a bit of a break where it takes you to some old guy in 1983 or whenever it was.
You see, that's really interesting from my perspective. Having just written this book about the extent to which RAMC stretcher bearers and indeed regimental stretcher bearers didn't understand themselves as separate in that sense, even though they're non-combatant. They are still servicemen in uniform, serving in the British military under military authority. And to that extent, they are the same and have similar motivations, and their morale as servicemen needs to be understood in the same way that we think about the infantry or the artillery. The dividing line between the infantry and the artillery is about how close artillerymen is at how close they get to the front line. It's not about proximity to the front line in that sense. It's about the fact that they're competence versus stretcher bearers as non-competence. So I think there's a narrative that's grown up over the course of the 20th century around stretcher bearers as somehow non-soldiers, which is very much not the case at the time. And the elision between conscientious objection and stretcher bearing, which emerges out of the war because the Friends Ambulance Unit essentially cuts this deal with the War Office that they will take conscientious objectors, non-absolutist conscientious objectors for service. It has become this dominant myth that stretcher bearers are somehow other as servicemen in the war. And I think the same is actually true of the various labor corps, whether it's the ASC or the Chinese Labor Corps, that non-competence creates an other form of service. And for something like the Chinese Labor Corps, yes, it does, but that's racially defined. For the British non-competence, it's really not how they understand themselves. But that narrative gets picked up by popular culture, like Charley's War, and reiterated across the 20th century. Yes, I'm going to have to go and read those episodes, aren't I?
Well, it's just odd that it brings you right to the now. I mean, he's a regimental stretcher bearer, so he's still with his own people, who all think he's mad to volunteer because it's a dreadful job where your chances of getting hit are even worse. But Charlie's just adamant that he doesn't really want to be. I can't remember what the catalyst now. He's got.
I'm not sure it's not sure it's the chances of getting hit or even worse. It's the fact that you don't have anything to fight back with. That at the time was understood. It was seen as being a dreadful job because you go out without arms, and that's seen as psychologically more challenging.
I think they're playing it. The play on the strip is it's in a heroic job because you've got to go out and rescue people under fire and bring them back. Which maybe that loops back in to saying Charlie's stupid, doesn't realise the threat that he's having to do, running around willy-nilly picking people up and then trying to evacuate them out. Which is right at the end where he's determined to get this guy out. And I think he ends with this guy in a wheelbarrow and he's desperately trying to wheelbarrow him to the aid station. And it's just about in sight when the bomb goes off and Charlie's never seen again. And the guy is rescued and then, I think Charlie later picks himself up out of some hole that he's been blown in and survives. But the guy is, in his 70s, reminiscing. Whatever happened to that guy who did so much to get me out?
It's fascinating to see how myth making works, though. I think would be my, from your description at any rate, is my sense of that.
Well, when we mentioned the Russian front of Charlie being shipped off there after Schnell, which again is such an interesting name to give with the kind of the German connotations. Who also, as an aside, gets killed. He gets sprayed by an acid thrower held by a German soldier, which apparently is a thing. Yeah, sure, why not? Because he makes all of his men charge 11 a.m. on November the 11th. But Charlie gets shipped off to the Russian front, and they frame it as Charlie being sent off to like the last front or the last moment or the last kind of ongoing aspect of the First World War, which made me wonder whether or not John Horn and Robert Goerth got scooped by Charlie's War in regards to the Greater War theory in the 1980s. It's like this conception of the Russian Civil War as being an extension of the First World War and therefore part of it.
Well, and that then raises the point of interesting that he doesn't end up in Ireland. And whether that would have been politically possible when these were published.
That would have been a risky one.
Yeah, could you have written a boys' cartoon, even an anti-war boys cartoon about 1920, 1921 in Ireland and the Irish Civil War?
Almost certainly not.
Yeah.
Did anyone else get the feeling that Pat Mills might or might not have read Paul Fussell, but he channels him all the way through?
And that's what makes me wonder if Pat Mills is explicitly referring to Oh, What a Lovely War, and yet we get a sense of channeling Paul Fussell. Yeah, I'm wondering if that's us as academics putting too much emphasis on Fussell, who is simply articulating a wider understanding of the war at the time, and we're calling it seminal simply because he's decided to actually articulate it.
It's just laced throughout with that sort of black humour and irony. Because the one of them that jumped out at me that really made me chuckle was when Charlie goes to London and he's on leave with his sergeant, and he says, walking past the Ritz Hotel, he says, "Blimey, Sarge, they've named a hotel after your dugout," because the sergeant's dugout's the Ritz. And the sergeant just sort of says, "Well, Charlie never was very bright." It's just brilliant.
Also, the fact that the sergeant is called Old Bill or Old Bill is a hell of a Bainsfather reference that begins right at the very beginning and then is carried on all the way through.
Pat Mills does that on purpose. He states at somewhere in a conference that it was purposefully renamed him.
I wonder how much the black humour of the soldier is a Fussell original, because it certainly comes up in Samuel Hines's A Soldier's Tale, which is slightly later, but what Hines is doing is talking about soldiers across American and British soldiers across the 20th century as a sort of cultural cohort, rather than dividing them up by the wars in which they served. And he talks a lot about black humor and about witnessing war is his thing. That one of the things that I like about Hines over Fussell is that Hines rather nuances the war is hell thesis to say that men enjoy war as well as loathing it, and understand it is having an individual purpose for them because they are witnessing history and participating in history.
Well, I don't know if he's enjoying it, but that black humour comes out throughout. I mean, Pat Mills must have mined every memoir he could to get in every little bit of slightly peculiar humour he could find from, digging up bodies and the names of the trenches. There's lots of it throughout, littered throughout. He does claim that he heavily researched the whole thing, and there was always lots of arguments over his research grants. I didn't know you got research grant for writing comics, but I suspect you won't now. But
you used to be able to get research grants to write novels, so I don't see why.
Well, in the heyday, these things are shifting hundreds of thousands a week. So,
if anybody listening wants to give me a research grant to do things like this, you're more than welcome. Please feel free to contact us on Twitter or.
Yeah, I know. Chris and I will both be taking donations.
How do we think about that sort of juxtaposition between the home front and the actual front, which comes across, which is actually struck me as being slightly peculiar when you look writing a boy's own sort of comic to suddenly switch to where the action might at first not appear to be?
Well, you get the home front there from the start, don't you? Because of the letters home, which I thought was a really nice. I thought that was a really nice framing of using the letters home as a way in. And that did, if we're back to that sense of authenticity, that did feel quite authentic. Although I thought the handwriting was too good, having read an awful lot of wartime letters.
The letter where I think it's his mum saying, I know you don't tell me everything that goes on, and that's fine, but I did just want to know, have you ever killed a man? And that being used in the middle of a battle was quite interestingly effective as a kind of what goes on in that sphere is not being transmitted in letters back to the other sphere.
He said he based those letters on letters from, I think it was his uncle or his great uncle. And he started to sort of run out of material almost as he started to chew through his uncle's letters. It's funny. What amused me is I think it's the first issue where he's asking for cake. We've got a letter from my granddad saying, "Don't send me pies. I want cake." There's something that rings true in them from that content, which I guess is he's lifting from his own library of wartime family ephemera.
A lot of the home front stuff that you end up with ends up inevitably interacting with, is it his brother-in-law or his uncle or something like that? Charley Bourne.
Oily?
Yeah.
It's his brother-in-law.
Yeah, who is, a crook and a war profiteer and a scoundrel and a shirker and all of that aspect, which then kind of gives a very kind of particular view of those who were not participating behind.
Again, this is a bit I probably need to go back and look at, but to what extent is that a representation? And certainly the war profiteer is an image that comes out of the First World War, but does that draw on the Second World War spiv? Or is it a specifically First World War?
There was a touch of the Sergeant Walker about him from Dad's Army. In regards to his moustache,
he's too oily.
Yeah, and I mean, oily in the cartoons is a fat cat. Effectively, he's a big round guy, whereas Sergeant Walker is a thin spiv. But there is definitely an element of the Second World War cheeky Cockney chappy about him. But it's illegitimate. Whereas there's something charming about Walker in Dad's Army, and patriotic,
which there isn't about Oily at all. He's very much drawn as. Are you in this? The poster with the guy walking past with his hands in his pockets, looking at everyone doing the work. He's very much drawn like that.
Because when I think of it, there's certainly there's that glut of State of the Nation novels that emerges in sort of 1919, 1920, where the war profiteer and the shirker are very much the villain as opposed to the honourable ex-serviceman, but tends to be a much more middle class. These are factory owners or their sons, or men who manage to wangle a desk job and are playing on their military service but didn't go to the front. So there's a slightly different emphasis to the First World War profiteer that comes out in the interwar period, I think, to the Second World War.
Well, the home front in Charley's War is very much we're all in it together. As his mother works at the munitions factory, his dad's a special constable, and there's the Zeppelin attacks on the east end of London, so the home front becomes the front line. And he talks about, I've forgotten the storyline. There's a storyline about the Canaries, isn't there? The women going yellow in the munitions factories. It all gets sort of churned over. But then you have Oily, who is there just milking the system to do anything he can to make money. At one point, he's trying to facilitate deserters' new identities and that kind of thing. So he sets himself aside from the war completely, shirking. I'm trying to think. He does something. What's he doing? What's he doing in the last episode when the war's won? He's there in those last frames as well. Say, well, I managed to get all the way through. I got another exemption, so I missed the end or something, isn't he? And
he's selling Union Jack flags. But buy your patriotic Union Jack flags here
from the most unpatriotic man of the whole strip kind of thing.
Yeah,
I wondered if this is actually an adult comic masking itself as a comic for kids.
I mean, I think to an extent they all are. I think there's that ongoing element of Battle and Commando and all those things aimed at children between the ages of, let's say, 9 and 13, or are they aimed at the parents of children who are aimed at 11 and 13 who also read them when they were between the ages of 11 and 13? Because those bound copies that both of you held up, this is meaningless to people who are listening to it, but the versions that you held up and the versions that I used to flick through in Dave's Comics in Brighton, I don't think they're for kids. I don't think they're bound together and done like that for kids. They're done for adults. Now, obviously, that's for adults who were reading them between, 79 and 86 or whatever it was that was come out. But I still think there's an element of these are not just for children, they're for the fathers of the children to read and relive their childhood.
Children's culture is very rarely just for children. And, you get this criticism. You see it in film criticism of Disney films or Pixar films even more. There's the storyline for the children, the images for the children, and then but they're jokes for the parents because they know that the parents are taking the children to see them. So, and that's quite where I think Angus's question is coming from, because on the one hand, if you've got these in something like Battle, that's aimed at children buying this for themselves, it's pocket money. Whereas, Chris, you're quite right. Once you get to the bound version at £15, which is the sort of average price that you're looking at online now for a secondhand version, for most children, that's of that age, that's not going to be what unless they're seriously saving up their pocket money for that they're going to have to ask for it for Christmas, or it's going to be bought for them by an adult. And to that extent, it needs to appeal to the adult market. But if they're created for a format where children are going to be able to buy it themselves with their pocket money, then the initial motivation isn't necessarily that they need to appeal to the adult market in the same way.
The peculiar thing that struck me about this is that these comics are aimed at children whose parents buy them for them, or they buy themselves with their pocket money in the late 70s, early 80s. But where are the bound versions of the other strips? They seem to have gone. Where's Sergeant Streetwise? Where's the other strips that were in these comics? They're not there as graphic novels. These are a sort of an early example of graphic novels actually that have been bound because there's an adult market for them, because they stand up on their own. So in actual fact, it is an adult comic that was acceptable to kids. It's taken Commando Comics still there, but it's taken them a long time to do bound versions. But I would argue those bound versions are not aimed at adults. Those bound versions are aimed at adults for buying them for their kids. They probably don't read them because they're a bit too simplistic. Admittedly, I'll put a caveat to that. It's been a very long time since I've read a Commando comic, and they are on my hit list to go back and keep looking at. I just never quite get to it. But they're much more simplistic with their, my God. And, as a kid, we all learnt World War II German from Commando comics, and we played roles shouting Schnell and Achtung and stuff because we'd read it, in Commando.
I think that's another aspect of it. In that sense, we've talked quite a lot about Pat Mills' own sense of research authenticity or historical authenticity, that he's drawing on research, which is something that's come up again and again in our discussions, isn't it? The creators of historical narratives of the First World War, contemporary creators of the historical narratives of the First World War, feel very determined to root themselves in their research. And to that extent, see what they're doing as educational, not just entertainment. And in that sense, the way it is aimed at kids is slightly different from pure entertainment, the Beano or something like that, which is just about making kids laugh over rude jokes, or at least the Beanos that my son gets these days. We will provide history education through this medium. I'm wondering how much that underpins at least the collection of these as graphic novels.
Well, I'd certainly wonder if at the time it was if it was seen as a collaborative strip where you could sit down with your granddad and say, "Look, Granddad, what I've just read," and then it becomes alive off the page because there's a family member explaining what's going on, rather than a simplistic strip that you would just read and move on.
I wondered something similar because, part of the aspects of, Charley Bourne teleporting his way around the Western Front is that it goes to an awful lot of various places, which are pretty recognisable for us as First World War historians. But I wonder how recognisable they would be to children now, and if that lack of a family connection in the late 70s, when you're getting that kind of post-1960s boom of the First World War, would have actually chimed with something that had more connection to them, because you could go and ask Grandad, "Oh, I read that Charlie's was at Teepval today. Tell me about Teepval."
But the inverse of that, of course, is that actually, at least for a certain 4-year generation of children, those locations might in some ways be more recognizable because they were the children who were taken on school trips as part of the centenary commemoration. And I'm thinking of Katrina and Anne-Marie's work on the educational legacy. And if we accept that dominant narrative of men returned from the war and didn't talk about it, do we think that that's just entirely a myth and that these were designed to prompt those recollections, or are they being written in spite of that idea that veterans were reluctant to talk about their their histories, at least up till the 1960s. I don't know. I suppose what I'm trying to say is, given that narrative of veteran reluctance to talk, I'm not sure as a motivation for writing or publishing these, I find that very convincing.
We mentioned relevance before about as you, Chris, mentioned relevance about do kids know these names, or would they have known the names? Pat Mills did state his start time for 1916 was not just around the Somme, but the visual cue that the soldiers suddenly had helmets. And he felt the introduction of the helmet would make it more relevant to kids who are much more familiar with the Second World War than the First World War. So when you get the Brodie helmet, it's a cue. It's a war. It's a modern war that I can somehow find a relationship to than a Boer War or something much older. So that's why it starts in 1916. The helmet is very specific on pointing to the helmet as the introduction of the helmet, rather than necessarily the Somme. Though I suspect, if push came to shove, he'd still start with the Somme rather than the helmet. which actually just brings me to, I think we should finally just touch upon, we haven't actually talked about the art, and if you read anything about Charley's War, the writing and the art go hand in hand. So it would seem slightly unfair not to talk about Joe Calhoun, the artist, and how we feel he's visually represented the war. It's very black and white.
It's very black and white. One of the interesting things, I mean, this slightly goes against some of the stuff we were talking about in regards to, we were able to describe Oily and we were able to describe Old Bill to an extent. I think it's actually quite difficult to describe what Charley looks like. Because he doesn't look like anyone. I mean, that's probably a design limit. He becomes an everyman. But the way that his face and, what his actual features are kind of ebb and flow a little bit depending on circumstance. And that it's Charley because everybody refers to him as Charley. But I couldn't tell you what he looks like.
He's the one, I always recognise because he's the one with the floppy hair on top and short back and sides. But it's an interesting point because he looks very similar to Ginger, who the reason you can tell between the two of them, his best mate, is because Ginger has freckles. And obviously, he's not there after whatever book it is.
I think what's interesting, certainly about the early ones, is just how busy it is, and it spills out of the frame a lot, which I think gives it a lot of energy, which is quite interesting when you're thinking about representing a war of stasis, right? There's actually a lot of a real sense of just how much movement there was for the individual, which I thought it captured that nicely, the sort of hurry up and wait element of it almost.
Because you don't always know which way to read the frames either. You see, you kind of read them in the way you feel works, and get on with it. And that it can be quite confusing with the letter writing actually, because I think that is one difference. For anybody who sat in an archive, who's held the letters of ancestors or sat in an archive reading these letters, they are there, and the page defines, even when there's a lot written and it goes sideways up the page and you're having to decode it. But here it becomes fragments. It is literally fragmented, sort of ripped bits and a lot of ellipses so that sentences don't end, which is really good in driving the story on, but slightly disingenuous in terms of representing how letters would have been read and the actual way in which letters become that bridge between lived experience and our later understanding of it. Well, I'm conscious now that we're well over our self-stated hour time limit, and we could probably waffle on for ages, even more about the artwork, because there's some bits and pieces to pick over. But Chris, as being our diary secretary, what are we looking at next time out? Because I've forgotten.
I have also forgotten.
We're looking at football, aren't we?
We're doing football. We're looking at football. That's right. We're looking at football.
Finally get some sports.
We're going to do some sports.
Not our strong suit.
Yeah, we when people meet us, they automatically think those are three people who are athletic, and participate adeptly in sports. So yeah, I think we're going to do sports. Yeah. Although obviously, I mean, I'm sure it'll come up next week that certainly for me, the unending kind of disappointment of realizing that I'm never going to have a professional football career was the moment when it wasn't because I have no skill or ability at the game. It was because I was simply too old. And that's why I'm never going to be a professional footballer. So I'm sure some of that bitterness will come flooding out next time.
Well, so until next time, when we're discussing football, a game, a sport of which I know next to nothing. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
Oh, it's a lovely walk. Oh, we walk with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Come fast, Richard, how can we spend our living? Oh, it's a lovely walk.